The Panama Canal has been sealed, not by storm, not by war, but by something found deep beneath the Gallard Cut. What began as a routine inspection spiraled into a full U.S. military lockdown, backed by DARPA, NASA, and black helicopters. The official reason? Technical difficulties. But insiders say otherwise. They speak of a metallic object not on any blueprint, emitting low-frequency hums that warp electronics and minds. The world's most vital trade route is frozen, and the truth is buried beneath layers of secrecy. This isn't a shutdown, it's a containment, and what they found might not be from this earth. The routine inspection that changed everything. It started like any other inspection, just routine maintenance. Engineers were checking the Gallard Cut, a narrow and unstable section of the Panama Canal known for its shifting rock. Ground sensors had flagged mild tremors, nothing unusual. They sent in infrared scanners to rule out any underground heat leakage. What came back wasn't just odd, it was impossible. Beneath the concrete, behind decades of reinforced barriers, something was giving off a rhythmic heat signature, like a heartbeat. Pulses came every 4.6 seconds, steady, uniform. That wasn't natural, and it sure wasn't part of any man-made system. Curious, they cleared the area and brought in deeper radar. What the scans showed chilled the room. A smooth metallic object buried inside a sealed chamber. No entrances, no records, not on any blueprint. When they tried to go in, strange things started to happen. Sonar scrambled. Equipment began losing power near the chamber. Flashlights flickered. Radios buzzed with distortion. A low, steady hum was coming from the object. Barely audible, but it vibrated through the concrete. Tools left nearby drained without explanation, as if the thing was sucking energy. "It doesn't look like anything we've ever built," said lead inspector Julio Torres. "And it doesn't look like anything nature made either." Whatever this thing was, it had been hiding under one of the world's busiest shipping routes for over a century. And now it was awake. The object wasn't just unknown, it was unexplainable. But when they tried to study it deeper, reality itself started to break. What came next defied physics and left the scientists questioning everything they knew. The object that broke the rules of reality. At first glance, it seemed simple. The object was metallic, about the size of a car, and sat perfectly still. But that's where the normal ended. Its surface was cold, ice cold, but thermal readings showed intense internal heat, moving in spiral patterns beneath its shell. It made no sense. Heat rises, but this stayed trapped inside like it was alive. Scanning it only made things worse. EM detectors shut down. LiDAR jammed. Any instrument trying to probe it fried or glitched. The closer the scan, the worse the interference. It was as if the object didn't just block technology, it rejected it. Scientists tried analog tools. Still nothing. One probe recorded a perfect blank, as if space itself bent around the thing. They placed touch-sensitive sensors on its surface. The readings were surreal. Gravity shifted by tiny amounts. Tools lost calibration. Even nearby clocks desynced by microseconds. A wrench left on the ground started vibrating on its own. It wasn't just resisting study, it was resisting observation. "It's like it doesn't want to be known," said Dr. Elena Cardozo. "Not hidden, unknowable." Then there were the symbols. Dozens of them, shallowly etched into the surface. Not letters, not language. Spirals, lines, geometric forms, so precise they seemed machine-made. Linguists were brought in, cryptographers too. No matches. Not Mayan, not alien, not gibberish, just completely foreign. But still, they looked intentional. What started as a maintenance scan was now a classified emergency. The object didn't just disrupt machines, it disrupted certainty. And that's when the helicopters arrived. The US lockdown and the black helicopters. Within hours, the US invoked its military rights under regional agreements. Clauses buried deep in treaties about strategic stability. Civilian workers were ordered out. No explanations, just national security. Then came the radio jamming. Black helicopters circled. Navy ships blocked canal entry points. Armed guards stood where tourists used to take photos. Overnight, the area was transformed into a no-go zone. The Miraflores locks, essential for global shipping, were sealed. Not a single vessel passed through. Not even a fishing boat, one canal worker said. The U.S. hadn't fully shut down the Panama Canal since World War II. But this time, they weren't guarding against nations. They were guarding against knowledge. DARPA arrived first, then NASA, then a unit from the Department of Energy's Advanced Physics Division, a group so secret most people didn't know it existed. Tents, labs, and underground fiber lines were set up overnight. The military cordoned off 5 square kilometers. Drones patrolled the skies. Anyone within 10 kilometers of the chamber had to surrender electronics. Officially, it was a systems malfunction. But unofficially, people on the ground knew better. You don't call in quantum physicists and shut down 5% of global shipping because of a glitch, said one anonymous contractor. This wasn't about keeping something safe. It was about keeping something contained. The world watches in the dark. In less than 24 hours, the closure of the Panama Canal sent shockwaves through the global economy. Oil tankers were rerouted, cargo ships idled in open water. Ports from Singapore to Rotterdam went silent. The canal moves over 5% of all global trade. Every lost hour meant millions in damage. But there was no press conference, no plan, just a carefully worded notice about technical issues. But behind the scenes, panic spread fast. Major logistics firms couldn't get answers. Marine tracking software flagged strange patterns. Ships held in holding zones, then abruptly redirected around the Cape of Good Hope. Flight paths were altered. Undersea cables were quiet. Someone was controlling the message. But what was really happening beneath that sealed chamber? Leaks began to surface. Not from officials, but from port workers, satellite analysts, and amateur radio operators. One report mentioned non-standard electromagnetic suppression. Another noted that weather satellites couldn't get a clean view of the zone. Social media lit up with speculation. Some claimed a nuclear threat. Others said bioweapon leak. But one phrase kept coming back. They found something. This isn't a canal delay, said trade journalist Anya de Rosieres. This is a global containment operation in real time. Every hour the canal stayed closed, the excuses got harder to believe. Yet still, no images, no answers. Just silence, ships, and black helicopters guarding the unknown. But inside that quiet, things were far from calm. Personnel near the object started experiencing things no training could explain. Time didn't move the same, and reality began to blur. Signals, rumors, and psychological side effects. The first signs were small. One technician reported feeling disoriented, even though he'd only been in the chamber for a few minutes. But footage showed he'd been there for over an hour. Another worker came out shaking, saying he'd heard whispers, though his comms were off. A pattern began to emerge. People weren't just reacting, they were changing. Reports described hallucinations, lost time, sudden déjà vu, and loops in memory. One analyst believed she had already read a report that hadn't been written yet. Another insisted he saw a door inside the object open, but footage showed nothing. They weren't just frightened, they were confused by their own minds. As these effects intensified, the personnel rotation was shortened to 30 minutes per session. Even that wasn't enough. The object seemed to respond to attention. Surveillance footage would flicker near it. Electric sensors died instantly if touched to the metal. Nearby wildlife fled the area. Birds rerouted their migratory patterns. Fish stopped swimming in the canal waters near the site. Inside, whispers spread through encrypted channels. The object is watching us back. Rumors claimed it wasn't a machine, but a sentient breach. Others believed it was not from space, but from underneath. And all the while, the object stayed silent, its hum pulsing every 4.6 seconds. Never changing, always there. And while the scientists scrambled for answers, governments began to turn on each other. Because the mystery of the object wasn't just scientific anymore, it was political. And the canal, once a neutral trade route, was becoming a trigger point. A geopolitical fuse is lit. It didn't take long for global tension to boil over. China, whose trade relied heavily on the canal, demanded access. Their ambassador cited treaties and trade equity. But U.S. officials refused. Other nations joined the pressure. Latin American leaders condemned the unauthorized military presence. Protesters in Panama City chanted, "El Canal no es tuyo." Russia released satellite images showing strange heat blooms and distorted energy readings near the canal. Their foreign ministry called it a violation of sovereign transparency. The Organization of American States met in an emergency session, but reached no consensus. Diplomats left the meeting angry and tight-lipped. Something had clearly broken protocol. Nations began quietly shifting assets. Naval movements near. The Caribbean picked up. Foreign embassies requested extra security in Panama. Private analysts noted satellite surveillance increasing over the site, while orbital radio traffic dropped to zero. Someone somewhere was locking this down harder than anyone had expected. "This isn't about trade anymore," said geopolitical analyst Reza Pahlavi. "This is about who controls the unknown." And in the background, the object remained untouched, still humming, still hidden. But now, the canal wasn't just a poke point for cargo. It was a militarized zone of suspicion. And the object wasn't just a mystery, it was a spark. And while countries argued, the laws of science began to fail inside the chamber. Because the more they studied the object, the less physics made sense. It wasn't just strange, it was impossible. The science that shouldn't exist. DARPA's top physicists were the first to say it out loud. This defies the standard model. Inside the sealed chamber, gravity measurements wouldn't stay constant. One moment, the object had mass. The next, it didn't. Decimal points shifted, fluctuating like a heartbeat. "Mass isn't supposed to pulse," said Dr. Adrian Nwoko. "That's not how matter works." Then came the quantum clock errors. Precise atomic clocks placed around the object stopped syncing. Time codes ran out of step, by milliseconds at first, then full seconds. One device looped the same timestamp for 74 seconds before updating again. For the scientists watching, it felt like reality was pausing, then catching up. Basic tools began to misbehave. Laser levels bent slightly. Metal warped near the object. When they dropped a magnet beside it, it rolled uphill against gravity. Measurements taken twice gave different results. "We weren't just watching something strange," said Nwoko. "We were watching the rules change in real time." None of their formulas held. None of the theories matched. It wasn't just that the object couldn't be studied. It was as if it redefined what studying meant. Any attempt to understand it bent back on itself. They weren't just hitting a wall. They were hitting something deeper than a wall, a limit in human comprehension itself. Then, during a magnetic pulse test, something happened that changed everything. The object didn't just react, it communicated, not with words, but with structure. Vector Zero awakens. During a standard electromagnetic induction test, the object pulsed, once, then again. But the second pulse wasn't random, it was structured, binary. Zeros and ones, perfectly timed, not a glitch, not an echo, a signal. And not just static, it changed depending on who was in the room. Mathematicians decoded the pattern into adaptive equations, forms that responded differently to each researcher's biometric data. It wasn't just sending numbers, said data analyst Maritza Tien. It was mirroring us, learning from us, changing itself to reflect the observer. One physicist called it a sentient equation. Another called it a reactive consciousness. When linguists tried to model it as language, they failed. It had no syntax, no symbols, just evolving math. But AI models trained on behavior data began to detect a pattern. The signal adapted like a living system. It didn't think, it responded. Not machine logic, not biology, something in between. Internally, DARPA gave it a name, Vector Zero. Not a weapon, not a machine, not a message, but a starting point. A kind of zero-state mind, something that wakes up only when observed, something that reflects the thoughts, emotions, and fears of whatever interacts with it, a mirror with memory. But what if this wasn't new? What if it wasn't alien, but ancient? That's when anthropologists were called in, and what they uncovered shook the story's foundation. The ancient echoes. While scientists struggled to explain Vector Zero, something unexpected surfaced. Several personnel exposed to the object, especially those experiencing hallucinations, drew symbols during recovery: spirals, V-shaped glyphs, radiating lines. At first, they were dismissed as stress responses, but one anthropologist recognized them, not from space, but from the past. "These are pre-Columbian," said Dr. Lourdes Guevara. "Glyphs found in isolated stonework across Central America, specifically in regions with legends about singing stones or hollow lights." The match was uncanny. Sites in Guatemala and Honduras had carvings nearly identical to the etchings on the object. Ancient stories told of sealed doors that hummed beneath the earth. Some legends even warned of artifacts buried under rivers to stop the sky minds from waking. Until now, these were seen as myths, tales from oral tradition. But now engineers were staring at those exact same shapes, pulsing from a device no one could date, no one could open, and no one could explain. And the location? The Panama Canal, a place torn open by humans over a century ago without ever fully exploring the bedrock beneath it. "We may not have built over a machine," said Guevara. "We may have built over a lock. The object wasn't placed there, it was already there, and our machines might have just opened the door." And while everyone tried to piece together the truth, the object kept sinking itself to the earth. Satellites blinked out, oceans shifted, and the rhythms of the planet began to match the hum of something deep below. Containment fails, space reacts. What began as a localized anomaly was no longer local. 42 days after the initial discovery, something changed. Global satellite networks unrelated to the Panama operation started experiencing synchronized data dropouts. Every 108 minutes precisely, telemetry from different systems would spike, pause, and shift. It was too consistent to ignore, and far too specific to be random. First, it was shrugged off as interference. But soon, GPS satellites blinked, their locations off by several meters. Naval vessels reported navigation errors. Private aircraft were quietly diverted. Then came the oceanic sensors. Deep-sea hydrophones off Colombia picked up strange subsea floor vibrations, like a low-frequency chime resonating every few hours. The vibrations weren't tectonic. They were too rhythmic, too artificial. Even the natural world began reacting. In the Caribbean and Pacific corridors near the canal, coral reefs suddenly bleached. Migratory birds diverted thousands of kilometers off course, as if they were actively avoiding the isthmus. Fish populations plummeted. Weather systems shifted subtly but unmistakably. One climatologist said, "It's like the region is under a stress field, one we don't have words for." Inside the facility, the containment lines buckled under pressure. Instruments became unreliable. The object's hum grew stronger, pulsing not just with sound, but with measurable resonance. Some engineers described feeling it in their bones. Vector Zero had expanded its influence. It was no longer being studied. It was reaching outward. "It didn't escape," one DARPA official whispered. "It synchronized." The world was beginning to fracture, not just from fear, but belief. Across nations and faiths, people started to respond, not with logic, with emotion, with awe, with dread, with prophecy. Panic, pilgrimage, and prophecy. The first pilgrimages began quietly, just a few locals claiming visions, dreams, a light pulling them toward the canal. Then hundreds arrived, on foot, by boat, by any means they could. Some carried relics, some wore ceremonial clothing. All of them said the same thing: it called us. Religious groups from around the world began interpreting the object through their own lenses. Some saw it as a harbinger of salvation. Others declared it a divine warning. Extremist cults claimed it was the doorway to ascension. Protests erupted across Central America, chanting, "Devolver el Canal," return the canal, not just from the US, but from the world of control and secrecy it now represented. Tensions spiked when a group of pilgrims breached the outer military perimeter. Dozens were arrested, some injured in a brief standoff. But what shook observers most wasn't the violence. It was what the group left behind: a ritual circle, made of stones, perfectly aligned with the object's 108-minute cycle. How did they know the frequency? No one could say. Inside military command, stress levels broke containment. Soldiers began showing signs of disorientation. Researchers stopped sleeping. Rumors flew of shared dreams, of voices whispering in perfect unison. For some, the object wasn't a threat. It had become a symbol. Of what, no one agreed, but it was no longer just a scientific event. It had become myth in real time. It started as a machine, said one psychologist. Now it's a mirror for our deepest beliefs. And as the psychological toll mounted, a new reality emerged. The site was no longer safe. It couldn't be held. It couldn't be studied. It couldn't be stopped. The decision was made, quietly, with fear in every corner of the room. They would walk away. The Great Abandonment. No one wanted to say it out loud, but the data left no choice. Vector Zero had become too unstable, too unpredictable, and too dangerous to control. The object no longer sat in its chamber. It radiated influence, bending perception, triggering mental collapse in anyone nearby. Scientists were now cycling out every 72 hours to prevent psychological erosion. Even then, side effects remained. One drone disappeared mid-scan. No signal loss, no explosion. Just gone. Vanished the moment it crossed a 3-meter threshold near the object. Analysis of its last frames showed distortion patterns, frames warped into spirals, unreadable to both machines and humans. It wasn't interference, said the lab technician. It was removal. Inside the core of the chamber, spatial readings turned hostile. Time lag increased. Laser pointers failed to reflect. Light itself behaved abnormally, bending away from the object. A drone dropped a steel probe, only to have it land 5 seconds before it was released. Time loops, visual echoes, a warping of space so complete it was no longer safe for organic beings to enter. The decision came from the top: full evacuation, indefinite lockdown. Plans were drawn to permanently divert global shipping. Emergency routes were expanded. Companies were informed under classified maritime advisories. The Panama Canal would be bypassed, not repaired. Humanity would retreat from what it could not explain, from what it might have awakened. Sometimes, a naval commander said, we don't seal the gates to keep something in. We seal them because we opened the wrong door. But the story didn't end with the evacuation. In the shadows of Vector Zero, the world began to rearrange itself. Economies bent, alliances shifted, and slowly, quietly, a new world began to emerge, shaped by absence, not presence. The new world in the shadow of the unknown. With the Panama Canal offline, the world had to adapt, fast. Trade rerouted through the Suez Canal, which quickly reached capacity. Within weeks, Africa's Cape of Good Hope, once considered obsolete, was now a vital artery. Insurance costs tripled, food prices spiked. Nations that once dominated global flow now found themselves at the mercy of bottlenecks they couldn't control. What followed wasn't collapse, it was realignment. Countries formed new economic alliances based not on ideology, but on raw survival. Central America's political landscape changed overnight, with leaders demanding more autonomy, transparency, and say in future maritime policy. Former superpowers watched their influence slip, not with war, but with irrelevance. The scientific world cracked into two. One half demanded caution, urging non-interference, total quarantine, and ethical lines that should never be crossed again. The other half pushed forward, quietly launching Project Lensfall, an initiative to replicate Vector Zero's chamber conditions in secret locations. If Earth had unlocked a gate, others wanted to build new keys. And through it all, the most terrifying truth remained unspoken. This was never just about Panama. The object had been dormant, but not dead, passive, but not isolated. And if its activation was not an accident, then it was a trigger. One that signaled a shift far beyond trade routes, governments, or physics. We didn't find it, said one Lensfall scientist. We crossed a line, and it noticed. The Panama Canal remains closed indefinitely. Ships are rerouted, economies strain, and the world reshapes itself around a silence it cannot explain. Inside that silence is an object now known as Vector Zero, A mirror, a signal, perhaps a warning. The science broke, the minds around it fractured, and still it hums. We didn't just find something hidden, we triggered something waiting. And in its presence, nations crumble, physics bends, and belief returns. Whatever it is, it changed us. Not because it spoke, but because it made us listen. The canal was a gate, and humanity may have stepped through without knowing.